December 14th, 1810. The snow had begun to fall upon Ravenscroft Manor, just as the clock in the great hall struck 11, and Eleanor stood trembling in her wedding gown of ivory silk, the same gown she had worn mere hours ago at their anniversary dinner when Frederick had raised his glass to her across the candlelit table, and she had believed herself the most fortunate woman in England. Now she faced a stranger, a man whose dark eyes had turned to flint, whose beloved face had become a mask of such cold fury that she could scarcely recognize the husband who had once whispered tender words against her hair. The letter lay crumpled on his desk between them, that terrible forged thing written in a hand she did not recognize, speaking of assignations and passion, and a love she had never felt for anyone but him. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word, "you must listen to me, Frederick. I have never betrayed you. I could never betray you. The child I carry is yours. Only yours." But he would not look at her, would not meet her pleading gaze, and when he finally spoke, his voice was as cold as the winter wind howling beyond the frosted windows. "You will rid yourself of that abomination," he said, each word precise and devastating, "or you will leave this house tonight and never return." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet, felt her hand move instinctively to her stomach, where their child, their precious child, had only just begun to grow, and she understood in that moment that the man she loved had become her executioner. "I will not," she breathed. "I will never destroy our child." And something flickered in his eyes then, something that might have been pain or might have been rage, before his expression hardened once more into granite. "Then you have made your choice," he replied, "and God help me, I wish I had never laid eyes upon you." She wanted to scream, wanted to tear at the lies that had built this wall between them, wanted to make him see the truth that should have been written in every glance she had ever given him, but his hand was already reaching for the bell-pull, and his face had turned away as though she had ceased to exist. The emerald ring he had placed upon her finger on their wedding day suddenly felt like a brand, and with trembling hands she pulled it free and laid it upon his desk beside that poisonous letter, a final offering he did not deserve, but which she could not bear to carry into exile. Martha found her on the great steps as the blizzard swirled white and merciless through the darkness, found her mistress standing frozen in ivory silk with snowflakes catching in her dark hair, and without a word the loyal maid wrapped her own worn cloak around Eleanor's shaking shoulders. In the shadows of the upper gallery, Lady Beatrice Sinclair watched the carriage disappear into the storm and permitted herself a small, triumphant smile, for the Ravenscroft fortune would now pass uncontested to her own bloodline, and the inconvenient Duchess had been swept away like so much winter debris. November 1810. The autumn rain traced silver patterns down the windows of the music room as Eleanor sat at the pianoforte, her fingers dancing lightly across the keys while Signor Marchetti counted time with gentle patience, and she thought herself the happiest woman in all of England, for just that morning she had felt the first stirrings of new life within her, and she was already composing in her mind the words she would use to tell Frederick that he would become a father before summer bloomed again. She did not see Lady Beatrice standing in the shadowed corridor beyond the half-open door, watching with narrowed eyes as the Italian music teacher leaned closer to correct the position of Eleanor's wrist, an innocent gesture that would be twisted into something sordid in the retelling. Lady Beatrice had arrived at Ravenscroft 3 months prior, ostensibly to recover from the strain of her mounting debts, though in truth she had come with darker purpose, for her own son stood to inherit the dukedom should Frederick die without legitimate issue, and the unexpected love match between the Duke and his modest bride threatened everything she had schemed to secure. That very afternoon, while Eleanor walked in the gardens dreaming of nurseries and tiny garments, Lady Beatrice sat in her chamber with pen and paper, crafting a letter in a hand she had practiced for weeks until it resembled Eleanor's own graceful script, filling the pages with passionate declarations to a fictional lover, with references to stolen meetings and a heart that belonged to another. She bribed a chambermaid named Polly with enough coin to clear the girl's gambling debts, securing testimony that the maid had seen the Duchess and the music teacher in an embrace that propriety forbade, had heard whispered endearments, and witnessed a kiss that had never occurred. The forged letter was hidden in Eleanor's music room, tucked behind a loose panel where it would be discovered at precisely the right moment, and Lady Beatrice arranged for Frederick to walk past that room on an afternoon when Signor Marchetti would be adjusting Eleanor's posture at the instrument, an image innocent to any observer without poison already dripping in their ear. Frederick had always feared, in the secret chambers of his heart, that Eleanor could not truly love him for himself, that a woman of such warmth and intelligence must have accepted his proposal only for his title and his fortune, and Lady Beatrice knew this weakness as a surgeon knows where to place the knife. She whispered her concerns to the Dowager Duchess first, planting seeds of doubt that the old woman eagerly watered, and together they presented Frederick with the letter, the testimony, the carefully staged scene, witnessed through a doorway. Signor Marchetti fled before he could defend himself or Eleanor, paid handsomely by Lady Beatrice to disappear rather than face accusations that would ruin him regardless of their falsehood, and by the time December snow began to fall, Frederick had built a fortress of rage around a heart that was breaking, too proud to question, too wounded to listen, and too thoroughly deceived to see the serpent coiled in his own household, smiling as his world burned down around him. The years that followed carved themselves into Eleanor's body and spirit, like winter wind shaping stone, each month stripping away another layer of the woman she had been, until what remained was something harder, something forged in the fires of survival and the fierce, protective love of a mother who would die before she let harm touch her child. She gave birth to Thomas in a charity hospital in the spring of 1811, with only Martha beside her, gripping her hand through hours of agony, while rain streaked the grimy windows and Eleanor bit through her lip rather than scream. For even in that extremity, she feared drawing attention, feared somehow Frederick's reach might extend even into that place of suffering, and steal away the child she had sacrificed everything to protect. Thomas came into the world with a cry that pierced Eleanor's heart like sunlight through storm clouds, and when they placed him in her arms, she saw Frederick's dark curls already crowning his small head, saw the shape of her own grey eyes blinking up at her, and she wept with a grief and joy so intertwined she could not separate them. They found lodgings in Whitechapel, a single room up 3 flights of narrow stairs on Crispin Street, where the walls wept with damp in winter and sweltered in summer, where Eleanor learned to stretch a shilling until it screamed for mercy, and Martha's clever fingers found work mending clothes for neighbours who had little more than they did. Eleanor discovered she possessed talents the Duchess of Ravenscroft had never needed, a neat hand with a needle, an eye for delicate work, and slowly she built a reputation among the seamstresses and tailors of the district as someone who could be trusted with fine embroidery, with detailed lacework, with the careful repairs that wealthier women required but could not perform themselves. Thomas grew like a determined weed in poor soil, finding sunshine wherever it fell, charming the washerwomen who hung their linens in the courtyard, learning his letters from Eleanor by candlelight, never once complaining about the thin soup or the patched clothes or the shoes that always seemed too small. He knew only that his father had died before he was born, a lie Eleanor told with steady eyes and a heart that cracked a little more each time, for how could she explain to her beautiful boy that his father had looked upon him as an abomination, had demanded his destruction, had chosen pride and poison over the family they might have been. By autumn of 1815, the cough that had plagued Eleanor through the previous winter had returned with vengeance, settling deep in her chest until breathing became. A labour and fever painted bright spots on her thin cheeks. Robert Langley, the physician who treated the poor of Whitechapel for whatever they could afford to pay, had been watching Eleanor with concern that had slowly transformed into something deeper, a quiet admiration for her dignity, a tender regard she pretended not to notice, because her heart, traitor that it was, still belonged to the man who had destroyed her. When the fever finally drove Eleanor to her bed, unable to lift her needle or rise to greet the dawn, it was 4-year-old Thomas who squared his small shoulders and announced to Martha that he would find help, would find coins for medicine, would save his mother the way she had always saved him. October 1815. The great house of Ravenscroft stood against the autumn storm like a monument to misery, its windows dark save for the single lamp burning in the study, where Frederick sat alone with a decanter of brandy that had become his most faithful companion in the 5 years since he had driven his wife into the winter night and told himself he was righteous in his rage. At 40 years of age, he looked closer to 50, the lines carved deep around his mouth and eyes, his dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples, his frame gaunt beneath clothes that hung looser than they had when Eleanor's hands had smoothed them across his shoulders, and her smile had made him believe, however briefly, that he might be worthy of love. He poured another glass and stared into the amber liquid as rain lashed the windows and the fire burned low in the grate, thinking as he always did in these dark hours of a face he had forbidden from the house. A portrait he had ordered destroyed, but instead had hidden in the attic, where he climbed sometimes in the deepest nights to look upon grey eyes that haunted his dreams. Lady Beatrice had suggested 3 times this month that he consider remarrying, presenting candidates like horses at auction, well-bred young women who would give him the heir the dukedom required, but the thought of another woman in Eleanor's place turned his stomach in ways he refused to examine too closely. A knock at the study door preceded James Harrington's entrance, and Frederick did not bother to hide the decanter or the evidence of how many nights had ended precisely this way, for James had been his friend since boyhood and had earned the right to witness his dissolution. James settled into the chair across from Frederick and accepted the glass pressed into his hand, though his eyes remained sharp and assessing in a way that made Frederick uncomfortable, as though his old friend could see through the walls he had built around the hollow place where his heart had once resided. "You should come to London," James said finally, breaking a silence that had stretched between them like the years themselves. "There are matters requiring your attention, documents that need signatures, business that cannot be conducted by proxy any longer." Frederick waved a dismissive hand, for London meant society, meant whispers behind fans and the pitying glances of those who remembered the scandal, meant the possibility of encountering the ghost of a life he had destroyed. But James persisted, leaning forward with an intensity that pierced through the brandy haze, saying there were things Frederick needed to see for himself, questions that had troubled James since that terrible December night, inconsistencies he had quietly pursued over the years because something about the accusations against Eleanor had never quite added up. Frederick felt his chest tighten at her name spoken aloud, felt the familiar rage rising to protect him from the doubt that whispered beneath it. But James held his gaze and said the words Frederick had never allowed himself to think. "I never believed she was guilty," James said quietly. "And I think somewhere beneath all that pride and anger, neither did you. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel." If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. October 22, 1815, and the dusk was falling over London like a grey shroud, the lamplighters beginning their rounds as Frederick's carriage made its slow way through streets clogged with the detritus of commerce, merchants closing their shops, servants hurrying home, beggars emerging from doorways to seek what charity the evening might provide. Frederick sat in the dim interior with his jaw clenched and his thoughts on the papers he had signed that afternoon, documents that meant nothing to him, business that James had insisted could not wait, though Frederick suspected his friend's true motive was simply to drag him from the mausoleum of Ravenscroft and force him to remember that a world existed beyond his guilt and brandy. The carriage slowed further as they approached his London townhouse on Grosvenor Square, a residence he had not visited in nearly 3 years, and Frederick was reaching for his gloves when a small figure darted from the shadows between parked carriages and stumbled directly into the path of his horses. The coachman shouted and pulled hard on the reins, the carriage lurching to a violent stop, and Frederick was out the door before his valet could move, some instinct propelling him toward the child who had fallen in the muddy street. The boy could not have been more than 4 years old, small and thin in a coat that had been patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. And when Frederick reached down to pull him to his feet, the child looked up with an expression of such terrified determination that something in Frederick's chest contracted painfully. Dark curls tumbled across the boy's forehead, tangled and damp from the light rain that had begun to fall, and his eyes met Frederick's with a shock of recognition that made no sense. For they were grey as storm clouds, grey as winter dawn, grey as eyes Frederick had once loved and then condemned. "Please, sir," the child said, his voice trembling but steady. "Please, sir, I am not a thief. I was only hoping someone might spare a coin, for my mother is sick, and we have no money for medicine." Frederick found he could not speak, could not move, could only stare at this small face that seemed assembled from pieces of his own reflection and pieces of something else, something that tugged at memories he had buried beneath 5 years of convinced righteousness. His valet was beside him now, making sounds of disapproval, suggesting they send the street urchin on his way, but Frederick's hand had already moved to his pocket, had already withdrawn a sovereign, a coin worth more than this child had likely seen in his entire brief life. The boy's eyes widened at the gold glinting in the lamplight, and for a moment Frederick saw not gratitude, but pride warring with desperation, a dignity that seemed impossible in one so young and so clearly destitute. "Thank you, sir," the boy whispered, and then he was gone, disappeared into the gathering darkness as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Frederick standing in the street with rain beginning to soak his coat, and a feeling in his chest he could not name, would not name, a feeling that followed him into the townhouse and up the stairs and into dreams that night, where grey eyes accused him of sins he had never allowed himself to consider. The first night after the encounter, Frederick did not sleep at all, but sat in his study with a glass of brandy untouched before him, staring into the flames, while grey eyes watched him from the darkness behind his closed lids, eyes that belonged to a child he had never seen before and yet somehow knew in the marrow of his bones. By morning his valet found him still dressed in yesterday's clothes, his face haggard, his orders strange and incomprehensible, as he demanded to know exactly where the carriage had stopped, exactly which street, exactly what time the lamplighters made their rounds in that particular quarter. October 23rd brought rain that drummed against the windows of the Grosvenor Square townhouse, and Frederick told himself he was merely taking air when he ordered the carriage to drive slowly through the streets near where the child had appeared, his eyes scanning every doorway and alley for a flash of dark curls or a patched coat or those impossible grey eyes that had struck him like a blow to the chest. He saw nothing but the ordinary misery of London's poor, beggars and street sellers and ragged children who looked at his fine carriage with hollow hunger, none of them the one he sought, none of them carrying that inexplicable weight of recognition. That night James Harrington called upon him and found Frederick standing at the window, watching the rain streak the glass, and when James asked what troubled him, Frederick could not form an answer that made any sense, could only speak of a child in the street, a beggar boy, a face that would not leave him. James listened with an expression Frederick could not read, something flickering behind his solicitor's careful eyes, and when Frederick demanded to know why a street urchin should haunt him so, James said nothing, but poured them both a drink, and sat in companionable silence that felt like waiting. October 24th, Frederick returned to the same streets twice, once at midday and once at dusk, and the coachman exchanged glances with the footman that Frederick pretended not to see, glances that spoke of concern and confusion, and the gossip that would inevitably spread through the servants' quarters about his Grace's peculiar new obsession. The boy was nowhere, vanished back into the labyrinth of London's poorer districts, and Frederick felt the absence like a wound he could not explain or justify. That night he dreamed of Eleanor for the first time in months, dreamed of her standing in snow with her wedding gown stained by winter. And when he woke, his face was wet with tears he had not shed in 5 years. By October 25th, Frederick had abandoned all pretense of rational behavior, sending footmen to inquire discreetly about a small boy with dark hair and grey eyes who had been begging near Grosvenor Square, a child with a sick mother, a child who spoke with surprising clarity for one so young and so poor. James arrived that evening to find Frederick pacing like a caged animal, and when his friend asked what Frederick intended to do if he found this child, Frederick stopped and looked at James with something breaking open behind his eyes. "I do not know," Frederick whispered. "I only know I must find him." October 26th dawned with the first clear skies London had seen in days, and Frederick woke from what little sleep he had managed with a resolve that felt like armor against the madness that had gripped him, a determination to find this child through method rather than aimless wandering, to use the considerable resources at his disposal rather than haunting street corners like a lovesick poet searching for his muse. He summoned his most discreet footman, a man named Collins, who had served the Ravenscroft family for 20 years and knew how to ask questions without revealing who wanted the answers, and gave him instructions that would have seemed lunatic from any other master, but were received with the impassive obedience of a well-trained servant. "Find a boy," Frederick said, approximately 4 years old, dark curly hair, grey eyes, wearing a patched brown coat, last seen begging near Grosvenor Square, and find where he lives, who his mother is, what their circumstances are. Collins departed without comment, and Frederick spent the day pacing his study, unable to concentrate on the business papers James had left for his review, unable to think of anything but those grey eyes that had looked up at him from the muddy street with such familiar defiance. By evening, Collins had returned with the first threads of information, reports from street sweepers and shop boys, and the network of servants who knew everything that happened in their districts, and the trail led east toward the poorer quarters of the city, toward narrow streets and cramped lodging-houses where families crowded 6 to a room and children learned to beg before they learned to read. October 27th brought more searching, more questions, more coins pressed into palms that opened readily for a duke's gold, and the picture began to emerge of a small boy called Tommy, who lived with his mother and an older woman servant in 2 rooms above a chandler's shop on Whitmore Lane, a boy known in the neighbourhood for his politeness and his clever way of speaking, a boy whose mother was a seamstress of unusual skill and refinement, who had fallen ill the week before and sent her son to seek charity rather than accept help from the physician who called upon her with increasing frequency. Frederick's hands trembled when Collins reported that the seamstress was described as lady fallen on hard times, dark-haired with grey eyes and a manner of speaking that suggested education far beyond her current station, and something in Frederick's chest began to crack open like ice on a winter pond when the spring sun finally touches it. October 28th, he went himself, dressed in plain clothes that could not quite disguise his bearing, and stood at the corner of Whitmore Lane, watching the windows of the rooms above the chandler's shop, watching for movement, watching for a small dark head, or a glimpse of the woman who might be anyone at all, anyone except the one impossible person his treacherous heart had begun to whisper she might be. Martha Fleming, standing at that very window to check on the strangers who had been asking questions all week, saw a tall figure watching from the shadows, and felt the cold hand of the past reaching forward to seize them all. October 29th, 1815, dawned with pale autumn sunshine that seemed almost cruel in its gentle beauty, and Frederick stood at the corner of Whitmore Lane for nearly an hour before he could make himself walk the final distance to the chandler's shop, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that would have shamed him had anyone been near enough to witness his hesitation. The neighbourhood was quiet at this late morning hour, working people already gone to their labours, and the smell of tallow and cheap candles drifted from the shop below as Frederick climbed the narrow stairs to the rooms above, each step feeling like a descent into some underworld from which he might never return unchanged. He knocked, and for a long moment there was only silence, then the sound of shuffling footsteps and the scrape of a bolt being drawn back, and Martha Fleming's face appeared in the gap of the barely opened door, older than he remembered, harder, her eyes widening with recognition that transformed instantly into fury so pure it seemed to burn the air between them. "You," she breathed, and the single word contained 5 years of hatred, 5 years of watching her mistress suffer, 5 years of poverty and fear and the slow, grinding destruction of everything they had once known. Frederick opened his mouth to speak, but Martha was already trying to shut the door, her aged hands pushing against the wood with desperate strength, and he found himself wedging his boot into the gap like a common criminal, his duke's dignity abandoned entirely in the grip of a compulsion he could neither name nor resist. "I mean no harm," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I only wish to speak with the woman who lives here." And Martha laughed, a sound like breaking glass, like winter wind through empty rooms, like every bitter thing she had swallowed since that December night when she had followed Eleanor into the snow rather than remain in a house ruled by such monstrous injustice. From somewhere behind Martha came a voice, thin with illness but still achingly familiar, asking who was at the door, and Frederick felt the world tilt beneath his feet because he knew that voice, had heard it in his dreams for 5 long years, had heard it pleading with him on a night when snow fell like ashes, and he had turned his heart to stone. "Martha," Eleanor called again, and then she was there, appearing in the dim hallway behind her faithful servant, and Frederick saw her for the first time since he had driven her from his house and his life, saw how thin she had become, how the bones of her face pressed sharply against skin gone pale from illness and want, how her dark hair was threaded now with early silver, how her grey eyes, the eyes that had haunted him in the face of a beggar child, went wide with shock and then with terror as she recognized the man standing in her doorway. Behind Eleanor, half hidden by her faded skirts, a small face peered out with those same grey eyes, and Frederick felt something shatter inside his chest as the boy from the street looked up at him without recognition, only the wary curiosity of a child confronting a stranger who had made his mother afraid. For a long moment no one moved, the tableau frozen as if time itself had stopped to witness this collision of past and present. And then Eleanor's hand shot out to grasp Thomas's shoulder, pulling him behind her with a fierce, protective gesture that spoke louder than any words she might have summoned to her lips. "Get out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the force of 5 years of suffering, 5 years of learning to survive, without the protection of name or fortune, or the husband who had cast her into the wilderness with nothing but the child growing inside her. Frederick could not make himself move, could not tear his gaze from her face, from the hollows beneath her cheekbones and the silver threading through her dark hair, and the eyes that had once looked at him with love, now burning with a hatred so pure it seemed to scorch the air between them. "Eleanor," he said, just her name, and the sound of it on his lips made her flinch as if he had struck her. "You have no right to speak my name," she said, her voice growing stronger now, fed by the rage that had sustained her through poverty and illness, and the endless grinding labor of keeping herself and her child alive. Martha had positioned herself beside her mistress, her aged hands curled into fists, and from behind Eleanor's skirts Thomas peered out with those grey eyes that Frederick could not stop seeing, could not stop recognizing, even as his mind refused to accept what his heart had begun to understand from the moment he first saw the boy in the street. "The child," Frederick managed, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. "The boy is yours." Eleanor laughed, a sound so bitter it seemed to poison the pale sunshine streaming through the dirty window. "He is mine," she said, "mine alone, raised without your name or your fortune, or a single moment of your care, and he will remain mine until I draw my last breath." Frederick took a step forward, drawn by some force he could not name, and Eleanor retreated, pressing Thomas more firmly behind her. "Do not come near him," she said, her voice cracking now. "Do not touch him. Do not speak to him. You forfeited any claim to him the night you drove us both into the snow." "What claim?" Frederick heard himself say, even as the question turned to ash in his mouth. "What claim would I have to your lover's child?" And Eleanor's face transformed then, the fear and hatred giving way to something else, something that looked almost like triumph mingled with despair, and she spoke the words that would shatter every certainty Frederick had built his cold and empty life upon. "You drove away your own son," she said, "your own flesh and blood, the heir you claimed to want so desperately, and he has grown up begging in the streets while you drank yourself to ruin in your grand estate. So tell me, your grace, which of us is truly the faithless one?" The silence that followed Eleanor's words seemed to swallow all the air from the cramped room, and Frederick found himself unable to draw breath, unable to move, unable to do anything but stand in that doorway while the foundations of 5 years crumbled beneath his feet like rotted wood, giving way to reveal the void beneath. "Your own son," she had said, and now Frederick's eyes moved of their own accord to the small face still peering from behind Eleanor's faded skirts, and he saw what he had refused to see on the street that rainy afternoon, what some part of him had recognized even then and fled from in terror, the dark curls that fell exactly as his own had done in childhood, the set of the jaw that matched the portraits of Ravenscroft men going back generations, and those eyes, those grey eyes that he had loved in Eleanor's face, and now saw reflected in miniature, watching him with a child's wary confusion. "You lie," Frederick heard himself say. But his voice held no conviction, only the desperate flailing of a man who felt the truth closing around him like a fist. "I never lied to you," Eleanor said, and her voice cracked on the words. "I never once betrayed our marriage. I loved you. God help me. I loved you with everything I had, and you threw me into the snow like refuse because your precious pride could not bear to question the poison your cousin poured into your ears." Frederick's hand shot out to grip the doorframe as if the room had begun to spin. "Lady Beatrice," he said, "what has my cousin to do with this?" Eleanor laughed again, that terrible broken sound, and behind her Martha made a noise of disgust. "You never thought to question her," Eleanor said, "never wondered why she was so eager to show you that letter, never asked yourself who might benefit from seeing your wife destroyed and your nursery empty. You simply believed every poisoned word and condemned me without a hearing, without mercy, without even the chance to defend myself." Frederick's mind was racing now, memories surfacing unbidden, Lady Beatrice's solicitous comfort in the weeks after Eleanor's exile, her suggestions about eligible young ladies who might make a suitable second duchess, her son who stood next in line to inherit if Frederick died childless. "Thomas," Eleanor said, "go with Martha to Mrs. Patterson's rooms," and the boy looked up at his mother with those grey eyes full of questions he was too young to ask. "Is the man going to hurt you, Mamma?" he asked, and Frederick felt something tear inside his chest at the sound of that small voice, at the fear in it, at the way the child he had never known positioned himself protectively before his mother, as if his tiny body could shield her from harm. "No one is going to hurt me," Eleanor said, her voice softening as she knelt to cup her son's face in her work-roughened hands. "Go with Martha now, and I will come for you soon." And she pressed a kiss to his dark curls, before Martha gathered him up and pushed past Frederick with a look of pure loathing, leaving Eleanor alone to face the man who had once been her husband and her whole world. Frederick reached into his coat and withdrew a purse heavy with coins. "You need money," he said. "Let me at least provide for the boy until I can determine the truth of all this." Eleanor's chin lifted with a pride that poverty had not managed to strip from her. "We survived 5 years without the Duke of Ravenscroft," she said. "We do not need his charity now," and she stepped back and closed the door in his face, leaving Frederick standing alone on the narrow landing, while somewhere in the street below a church bell tolled the noon hour, and his entire world collapsed into ruins around him. Frederick did not remember the walk back to his London house, did not remember passing through the streets where he had searched so desperately for the child who had turned out to be his own flesh and blood, did not remember anything until he found himself standing in his study with a glass of brandy in his hand, and James Harrington's worried face swimming before him in the gathering dusk. "You found her?" James said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. And Frederick could only nod as he drained the glass and reached for the decanter with hands that would not stop trembling. "She says the boy is mine," Frederick managed to say, his voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "She says I drove away my own son," and even as the words left his lips, he could see Thomas's face again, those grey eyes that were Eleanor's eyes, that dark hair that fell in the same unruly curls that Frederick himself had possessed as a child, the stubborn set of that small jaw that matched every portrait in the Ravenscroft gallery going back 200 years. James was silent for a long moment, and when Frederick finally looked up, he saw something in his friend's face that stopped his breath, a grave sorrow mingled with something that looked almost like relief. "I never believed her guilty, Frederick," James said quietly, and the words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Frederick had believed for 5 long years. "What do you mean?" Frederick demanded, his voice rising. "You were there. You saw the letter. You heard the testimony." "I saw a letter that troubled me from the first," James replied, "and I heard testimony from a servant who disappeared with a suspiciously large sum of money within a fortnight of giving it, and I have spent 5 years gathering evidence that I knew you would refuse to hear until you were ready." Frederick sank into a chair as James began to speak, telling him of investigations conducted in secret, of the music teacher tracked down in Bristol who swore he had never touched Eleanor and had fled only because Lady Beatrice threatened to have him hanged, of handwriting experts who declared the love letter a clever forgery, of financial records showing Lady Beatrice's mounting debts and her desperate need for the Ravenscroft fortune to pass to her own son. Outside the windows, lightning split the autumn sky, and thunder rolled across London like the judgment of God. And Frederick sat motionless as the architecture of his certainty collapsed around him, as every cruel word he had spoken to Eleanor on that December night returned to him with the force of physical blows, as the face of his son rose before him again and again, that small boy who had begged outside his carriage while his father sat in comfort and ignorance mere feet away. By the time James finished speaking, the storm had passed, and the first grey light of dawn was creeping through the windows, and Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Ravenscroft, sat amid the ruins of his pride and wept for the first time since he was a child, wept for Eleanor shivering in the snow, for Thomas growing up in poverty, for the family he had destroyed with his own blind arrogance. The news of Lady Beatrice's arrival in London reached Frederick on the morning of November 1st, carried by a footman who looked as though he would rather have delivered news of plague, and Frederick felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest as he understood that his cousin had heard rumours of his search, of his discovery, of the questions that were now being asked in places where she had thought her secrets safely buried. She came to his study within an hour of her arrival, sweeping through the door in a travelling dress of deep blue silk, her face arranged in an expression of concern that Frederick had once believed genuine, but now saw as the mask it had always been, and he watched her approach with eyes that seemed to belong to a different man than the one who had wept in this very room only hours before. "Dearest Frederick," she began, her voice honey-sweet with false worry, "I came as soon as I heard you were unwell. The servants have been quite distressed by your behaviour," and she reached out as if to touch his arm, but something in his face made her hand falter and fall away. "I am perfectly well, Beatrice," Frederick said, surprised by how steady his voice emerged, when inside he was a tempest of rage and grief, and the terrible need to know the full truth before he acted. "I have merely been conducting some business that has proven unexpectedly illuminating." He watched her face and saw the flicker of fear behind her eyes, quickly suppressed but not quickly enough, and in that moment he knew with absolute certainty that James was right, that Eleanor had been innocent, that he had driven away his wife and son based on lies manufactured by this woman who now stood before him with her perfumed silks and her practiced smile. "What sort of business?" she asked lightly, and Frederick marveled at her composure, at the years of deception that had taught her to control every muscle of her face while her schemes crumbled around her. "The business of the past," he replied. "I have been thinking a great deal about Eleanor lately, about the night she left, about the evidence that condemned her." And he saw Beatrice's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on her reticule. "That was 5 years ago," Beatrice said quickly. "Surely there is no purpose in revisiting such painful memories. You made the right decision." Everyone agreed. "Not everyone," Frederick said softly, and he rose from his chair and moved to the window where the pale November light fell across his haggard features. "James never believed the accusations, and he has spent 5 years gathering evidence that suggests I was the greatest fool in England, that my wife was innocent, that I cast out the mother of my child based on forged letters and bribed testimony." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of carriage wheels on the street below, and when Frederick turned back to face his cousin, he saw that her mask had finally cracked, revealing beneath it the desperate, calculating creature who had destroyed his family for the sake of her gambling debts, and her son's inheritance. "You deny it, then?" Frederick said, his voice deceptively calm as he watched Beatrice struggle to compose herself. "You deny that you forged a letter in Eleanor's hand, that you bribed a servant named Sarah Collings to testify to intimacies she never witnessed, that you arranged for the music teacher, Mr. Whitmore, to be found in circumstances designed to suggest guilt where none existed." "I do not know what you are talking about," Beatrice said, but her voice had lost its honeyed smoothness, and her eyes darted toward the door as though calculating the distance. "This is madness, Frederick. You are unwell. The strain of these years has affected your mind, and I must insist that you rest before you say things that cannot be unsaid." Frederick moved to the door and stood before it, blocking her escape, and he saw real fear in her face now, the fear of a woman who has built her life on lies and watches the foundation crumble beneath her feet. "Sarah Collings died last winter in a workhouse in Manchester," Frederick said quietly. "But before she died, she made a confession to the parish priest, a confession that James obtained through considerable effort, in which she admitted that you paid her £50 to tell lies about the Duchess and threatened to have her transported if she ever spoke the truth." Beatrice's face had gone the colour of old parchment, and Frederick watched her hands tremble as she clutched her reticule like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. "The music teacher, Mr. Whitmore, has been located in Bristol," Frederick continued, "where he has spent 5 years living in fear of the false accusations you arranged against him, and he has provided a sworn statement that he never touched Eleanor, never wrote to her, never did anything improper, and that you threatened to see him hanged if he did not flee, and leave behind circumstances that appeared damning." "It was for your own good," Beatrice whispered, and the confession came spilling out like poison from a lanced wound. "She was beneath you, Frederick, a nobody from a family of no consequence, and she would have given you children who would have diluted the Ravenscroft blood. My son should have been your heir. The estate should have come to our branch of the family. I did what any woman would have done to protect her child's inheritance." Frederick stared at his cousin and saw her clearly for the first time in his life, saw the petty jealousy and the grasping ambition and the utter absence of conscience that had allowed her to destroy an innocent woman and condemn a child to poverty and tear apart a marriage that might have brought Frederick the happiness he had spent 5 years pretending he did not want. "I loved her," Frederick said, and the words surprised him as they left his mouth. "I loved Eleanor, and you took her from me. You took my son from me. You took 5 years of my life and turned them into ashes, and now you will answer for what you have done." Beatrice lunged for the door, but Frederick caught her arm, and in that moment James entered the study followed by 2 constables, and Lady Beatrice Sinclair's screams of protest echoed through the house as she was led away to face justice for the crimes she had committed in the name of greed. The hours following Lady Beatrice's arrest passed in a blur of activity and paperwork, and the grim satisfaction of justice finally set in motion, but Frederick found himself unable to rest, unable to think of anything except the woman he had wronged and the child he had never known. And as evening fell on November 1st, he stood before the window of his study and stared at the darkening London streets, while James spoke quietly of legal proceedings and evidence and the long road ahead. "I must go to her," Frederick said at last, interrupting James in the middle of a sentence about court dates and formal charges. "I must tell Eleanor what has happened. She deserves to know that the truth has been found, that her name will be cleared, that the woman who destroyed her life will face justice." James was silent for a long moment, and when Frederick turned to look at his friend, he saw concern mixed with something that might have been hope in those steady eyes. "She may not wish to see you," James said carefully, and Frederick felt the truth of those words like a blade between his ribs, knowing that Eleanor had every right to close her door against him forever, every right to hate him until her final breath, every right to take their son and disappear into a world where the Duke of Ravenscroft could never find them. "I know," Frederick whispered, "but I must try. I must at least offer her this much, the knowledge that I know now what I should have known then, that I believe her, that I was the greatest fool who ever lived, and if she turns me away I will accept that as nothing less than I deserve." He rode through the autumn darkness with his heart pounding against his chest like a caged thing desperate for freedom, and the familiar streets seemed different now, transformed by the knowledge of what they had witnessed, the poverty his wife had endured, the courage his son had shown, the years of suffering that could never be reclaimed, no matter how many coins he threw at lawyers and courts and the machinery of justice. When he reached the narrow building where Eleanor lived, he stood for long minutes in the street below, looking up at the single candle burning in the window, and he thought of all the nights she must have sat by that flame, sewing until her fingers bled, wondering if anyone in the world remembered that she had once been the Duchess of Ravenscroft, wondering if the man who had sworn to love and protect her ever thought of her at all. Martha answered his knock with the same hostile glare she had worn before, but something in Frederick's face must have given her pause, because she did not immediately slam the door, and when he said quietly that Lady Beatrice had been arrested, that the truth had been discovered, that he had come only to tell Eleanor and nothing more, the old servant's expression shifted from suspicion to something that might have been the first fragile seed of belief. Eleanor was sitting by the window when Martha admitted Frederick to the cramped room, and though she had been warned of his arrival, she still felt the shock of seeing him there in that small space, his tall frame seeming to fill the doorway, his dark eyes fixed upon her face with an expression she had never seen before, an expression that held neither the cold fury of that December night, a years past, nor the suspicious hostility of their confrontation days ago, but something far more unsettling, something that looked almost like the shattering of a man who has discovered that everything he believed was built upon lies. Thomas was asleep in the corner, his dark curls tumbled across the pillow Martha had mended a dozen times, and Eleanor's first instinct was to rise and place herself between her son and this man who had once ordered her to destroy the child or face exile, but something in Frederick's bearing stopped her, some quality of devastation that kept her seated by the window with her work, roughened hands folded in her lap. "Lady Beatrice has been arrested," Frederick said, and his voice was hoarse, as though the words had been dragged from somewhere deep within his chest. "She has confessed to everything, Eleanor. The forged letter, the bribed servant, the staged scene with the music teacher. All of it was her design. All of it was lies. And I believed her. I believed every poisonous word she fed me, and I drove you out into the snow on a winter night when you were carrying my child." Eleanor felt the words wash over her like water breaking against stones that had been battered by waves for so long they had forgotten what stillness felt like, and she found that she could not speak, could not move, could only sit there in the pale candlelight and watch as Frederick Ravenscroft, the proud and terrible Duke who had cast her into darkness, crossed the room and fell to his knees before her chair like a penitent seeking absolution from a saint. "I cannot ask your forgiveness," Frederick said, and there were tears on his face now, tears that Eleanor had never seen him shed in all the months of their marriage, not even on their wedding night when she had been so frightened and he had been so unexpectedly gentle. "I cannot ask because there is no forgiveness great enough to cover what I have done. I looked into your eyes and I called you faithless. I looked at your tears and I believed them false. I drove you from your home with nothing but the clothes on your back, and I never once, in 5 years, allowed myself to wonder if I might have been wrong." Eleanor's hands were trembling now, and she pressed them hard against her knees to still them, and she thought of all the nights she had spent in this room sewing until her fingers bled. All the mornings she had risen, before dawn, to seek work, all the times she had held Thomas and told him stories of a father who had died rather than let him know the truth of his abandonment, and she wondered if there were words in any language sufficient to bridge the chasm that 5 years of suffering had carved between them. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the dark hours of countless nights, had pictured Frederick Ravenscroft on his knees before her begging for forgiveness, had scripted the cutting words she would deliver, the cold dismissal she would offer, the satisfaction she would feel at watching him suffer as she had suffered. But now that the moment had arrived, Eleanor found that her carefully hoarded fury had turned to ash in her mouth, and she could not speak the speeches she had rehearsed, because the man kneeling before her was not the monster she had constructed in her memory, but a broken creature, whose tears fell upon her worn skirts like rain upon parched earth. "I told you," she finally said, and her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I told you that night that I had never been unfaithful. I begged you to believe me. I offered to swear upon any holy book you chose. And you looked at me as though I were something unclean, and you told me to destroy our child, or leave your house forever, and I walked out into the snow with nothing but my wedding gown and the life growing inside me." Frederick's shoulders shook with sobs he could not contain, and Eleanor watched as the proud Duke of Ravenscroft wept like a child at her feet, and she felt something shifting in her chest, some wall she had built, brick by painful brick over 5 years, beginning to crack despite her determination to keep it standing. "I have no defense," Frederick said through his tears. "I have no excuse. I believed a scheming woman over my own wife because I was afraid, Eleanor. I was so terrified that someone as good and beautiful and kind as you could never truly love someone like me, that when Beatrice showed me proof of betrayal, some part of me thought, of course she never loved you. Of course it was all pretense. And that fear made me cruel beyond any hope of redemption." Thomas stirred in his sleep, and Eleanor's eyes flew to her son, her whole body tensing with the instinct to protect, and Frederick followed her gaze, and she saw the fresh agony that crossed his face as he looked upon the sleeping child, this boy he had never held, never comforted, never watched take his first steps or speak his first words. "He has your chin," Frederick whispered, "and your mother's hands. I can see it now. I could see it that day in the street when he asked me for a coin, and I felt something I could not name, something that kept me awake for nights afterward, something that drove me to search every corner of London until I found him again." Eleanor looked at her husband, truly looked at him for the first time since he had entered the room, and she saw the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines that grief and guilt had carved around his eyes, the gauntness of cheeks that had once been full with health and prosperity, and she understood that while she had suffered in poverty, he had suffered in plenty, that his fine house and full table had been their own kind of prison. She thought of Robert Langley, dear kind Robert, who had tended her fevers and never asked for payment, who had looked at her with such gentle hope and never pressed his suit because he knew she was not free, not truly, not in the eyes of the law or the church. And she wondered what he would say if he could see this scene, the Duke of Ravenscroft weeping at her feet in a room that cost less per month than a single bottle of the wine that graced his table. "I do not know what you want from me," Eleanor said at last, and her voice was steadier than she had expected, steadier than she felt. "I do not know what you imagine I can give you. Absolution, perhaps. A declaration that all is forgiven and forgotten. That the 5 years I spent wondering if my son and I would survive another winter were merely an unfortunate misunderstanding. That the nights I lay awake listening to Thomas cough and praying I would not have to choose between food and medicine were simply the price of a miscommunication between husband and wife." Frederick flinched at each word as though she had struck him, and perhaps she had. Perhaps words were the only weapons she had ever possessed, and she had learned to wield them with precision during the long years of her exile. "I want nothing," Frederick said, and his voice broke on the word. "I want nothing except to know that you and the boy, that Thomas, that my son will never want for anything again. I want to spend whatever years remain to me trying to repair what cannot be repaired. I want to look upon his face each day and see the child I should have held from his first breath. I want to hear him call me father even though I know I have no right to that name. I have forfeited every right a man can forfeit." Eleanor looked at Thomas sleeping in the corner, at his small chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath, and she thought of all the times she had told him that his father was dead, that his father had been a good man who loved them both, that his father would have moved heaven and earth to be with them if only he could have, and she wondered how she would explain to him that she had lied, that his father was alive and kneeling in their room with tears streaming down his face, that his father was the Duke of Ravenscroft, and Thomas was heir to one of the greatest fortunes in England. "He does not know you exist," Eleanor said quietly. "I told him his father died before he was born. I told him his father loved him. I gave him a fantasy because I could not give him the truth. I could not tell a child that his father had ordered his destruction, that his father had cast his mother into the streets, that his father had chosen pride over love and left us both to starve." Frederick made a sound that was not quite human, a sound of such profound anguish that Eleanor felt it in her own chest, and she understood then that whatever happened next would change all of their lives forever. The room fell silent save for Thomas's gentle breathing and the distant sounds of the street below, and in that silence Eleanor felt the weight of 5 years pressing down upon her chest, 5 years of struggle and fear and fierce protective love, 5 years of telling herself that she hated this man when some treacherous part of her heart had never stopped remembering the way he had looked at her on their wedding day, the way his hands had trembled when he first held her, the way he had whispered against her hair that he could not believe his fortune in winning such a bride. "What would you have me do?" Frederick asked, and his voice was hoarse from weeping, his face ravaged by emotions he had spent half a decade refusing to feel. "Tell me what I can do. Tell me how to begin to make amends for the unforgivable. Tell me how to earn even a moment in his presence. I will do anything, Eleanor. I will crawl through the streets of London if you ask it. I will give away every penny of my fortune. I will spend the rest of my life on my knees if only you will let me know my son." Eleanor closed her eyes and saw herself as she had been that December night, young and terrified and heavy with child, walking through the snow in her wedding gown while the world she had known crumbled behind her, and she saw herself in the months that followed, sick with pregnancy and grief, sewing until her fingers bled to earn enough for bread, holding her newborn son in a room so cold she could see her breath, and promising him that she would never let anyone hurt him as his father had hurt her. "I cannot forget," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet Frederick's desperate gaze. "I cannot pretend that the past did not happen. I cannot erase the nights I went hungry so Thomas could eat, the times I sold my wedding ring and then bought it back because it was the only thing of value I possessed, the fear that woke me every morning wondering if this would be the day we were turned out into the streets. You cannot buy absolution, Frederick. You cannot purchase forgiveness with your duke's gold and your fine promises." Frederick bowed his head in acceptance of her words, and Eleanor saw that he did not argue, did not try to defend himself or minimize her suffering, and something in that silent acknowledgment touched the place in her heart she had thought permanently frozen. "But Thomas," Frederick whispered, looking toward the sleeping child with such sad longing that Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "He is innocent in all of this. He did not choose to be born into this tragedy. He did not choose to grow up without a father. Please, Eleanor, whatever you decide about me, whatever punishment you deem fitting, do not let him suffer for my sins. Let me give him the life he deserves. Let me give him his birthright. Let me at least try to be the father I should have been from his first breath." Eleanor looked at her son, at his dark curls spread across the threadbare pillow, at his small hand curled beneath his chin, at the face that held so much of Frederick and so much of herself, and she knew that whatever choice she made in this moment would shape the rest of all their lives. She thought of the morning after Thomas was born, how she had lain in the narrow bed in the room Martha had found for them, the cheapest room in a boarding house that smelled of cabbage and despair, and she had looked at her son's face for the first time in the grey winter light, and seen Frederick looking back at her, the same dark brows and determined chin, and something about the set of his mouth that was pure Ravenscroft, and she had wept then, not from joy but from grief, because she knew that her son would never know his father, would never run through the halls of Ravenscroft Manor, or ride the horses in the paddock, or learn to fence and shoot, and do all the things a duke's heir should learn, and she had promised herself in that moment that she would give him everything she could, every scrap of love and education and dignity that lay within her power, that she would raise him to be the man his father should have been. "You ask me to trust you," she said now, her voice barely above a whisper. "You ask me to place my son's future in the hands of the man who nearly destroyed us both. And I do not know if I am strong enough or foolish enough to do such a thing. I do not know if the woman I was 5 years ago still exists somewhere inside me, or if she died that night in the snow along with everything else I believed about love and marriage and the goodness of men." Frederick raised his head slowly, and Eleanor saw that his face was transformed by tears and hope and fear, saw that the proud Duke of Ravenscroft had been stripped down to something raw and human. And she remembered suddenly the night he had proposed to her, how nervous he had been despite his title and his wealth, how his voice had trembled when he asked if she could possibly consent to be his wife. And she had loved him then for that vulnerability, had believed she had found a man who would cherish her precisely because he understood what it meant to be uncertain. "I will prove myself," Frederick said, and his voice was stronger now, though still rough with emotion. "I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving that you can trust me. I will submit to whatever conditions you require, whatever distance you need, whatever time it takes for you to believe that I am not the monster who drove you into the snow. I was that monster, Eleanor, I do not deny it, but I swear to you on everything I hold sacred that I will become someone worthy of being Thomas's father, someone worthy of your forgiveness, even if that forgiveness never comes. I will wait and I will work and I will prove myself through actions rather than words, because words are cheap, and I have learned too late that the words I believed 5 years ago were lies crafted by someone who wished us both destroyed." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some frozen thing beginning to crack, and she did not know if it was her hatred thawing or her heart breaking all over again, and she thought that perhaps they were the same thing. Perhaps forgiveness and grief were two sides of the same coin, and she looked at Frederick kneeling before her and saw both the man who had destroyed her and the man who might, impossibly, help her rebuild. She thought of the morning after Thomas was born, how she had lain in the narrow bed in the room Martha had found for them, the cheapest room in a boarding house that smelled of cabbage and despair, and she had looked at her son's face for the first time in the grey winter light, and seen Frederick looking back at her, the same dark brows and determined chin, and something about the set of his mouth that was pure Ravenscroft, and she had wept then, not from joy but from grief, because she knew that her son would never know his father, would never run through the halls of Ravenscroft Manor, or ride the horses in the paddock, or learn to fence and shoot and do all the things a duke's heir should learn, and she had promised herself in that moment that she would give him everything she could, every scrap of love and education and dignity that lay within her power, that she would raise him to be the man his father should have been. "You ask me to trust you," she said now, her voice barely above a whisper. "You ask me to place my Totten's future in the hands of the man who nearly destroyed us both. And I do not know if I am strong enough or foolish enough to do such a thing. I do not know if the woman I was 5 years ago still exists somewhere inside me, or if she died that night in the snow along with everything else I believed about love and marriage and the goodness of men." Frederick raised his head slowly, and Eleanor saw that his face was transformed by tears and hope and fear, saw that the proud Duke of Ravenscroft had been stripped down to something raw and human, and she remembered suddenly the night he had proposed to her, how nervous he had been despite his title and his wealth, how his voice had trembled when he asked if she could possibly consent to be his wife. And she had loved him then for that vulnerability, had believed she had found a man who would cherish her precisely because he understood what it meant to be uncertain. "I will prove myself," Frederick said, and his voice was stronger now, though still rough with emotion. "I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving that you can trust me. I will submit to whatever conditions you require, whatever distance you need, whatever time it takes for you to believe that I am not the monster who drove you into the snow. I was that monster, Eleanor. I do not deny it, but I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, that I will become someone worthy of being Thomas's father, someone worthy of your forgiveness, even if that forgiveness never comes. I will wait, and I will work, and I will prove myself through actions rather than words, because words are cheap, and I have learned too late that the words I believed 5 years ago were lies crafted by someone who wished us both destroyed." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some frozen thing beginning to crack, and she did not know if it was her hatred thawing or her heart breaking all over again. And she thought that perhaps they were the same thing. Perhaps forgiveness and grief were 2 sides of the same coin. And she looked at Frederick kneeling before her and saw both the man who had destroyed her and the man who might, impossibly, help her rebuild what remained of their shattered lives together. The days that followed Frederick's declaration stretched before them like a bridge built of glass, beautiful in its fragility but terrifying in the knowledge that one wrong step might shatter everything. And Eleanor found herself watching him with eyes that had learned suspicion over 5 long years, watching for the signs of the cold, proud man who had driven her into the snow, watching for the moment when his patience would fracture and reveal the monster she remembered. But instead she saw only a man humbled by the weight of his own sins. A man who arrived each morning at her small lodgings with baskets of food he claimed were merely practical, with coal for the fire he insisted was simply sensible given the approaching winter, with toys for Thomas that appeared wrapped in brown paper, with no card attached as though they had materialized from the air itself rather than from the purse of a duke desperate to know his son. Thomas, who had never known a father, who had been told only that his father was gone and could not return, began to watch for the tall, dark stranger who brought sweets in his pockets and who knelt on the worn carpet to examine whatever treasure Thomas wished to show him. And Eleanor saw the hunger in both their faces, the same desperate reaching toward connection that neither fully understood, and she thought her heart might break all over again from the terrible beauty of watching her son fall in love with the father who had nearly destroyed them both. Martha remained suspicious, hovering in doorways with her arms crossed and her eyes sharp, intercepting Frederick when he arrived too early or stayed too long, reminding Eleanor in fierce whispers that a leopard does not change his spots and a duke does not become a decent man simply because he sheds a few tears and speaks pretty words of regret. But even Martha began to soften by imperceptible degrees as she watched Frederick submit to her interrogations without complaint, watched him thank her for the terrible tea she deliberately brewed too strong, watched him accept her insults with a quiet acknowledgement that he deserved far worse than anything she could devise. James Harrington came to visit as well, bringing news of his investigation into Lady Beatrice that made Eleanor's blood run cold with vindication and rage, for he had found the servant who had been bribed to lie, had tracked down the music teacher living in disgrace in a small village in the north, who wept with relief when he learned that someone finally believed in his innocence, had even obtained a sample of Lady Beatrice's handwriting that matched perfectly the forged love letter that had condemned Eleanor to exile and poverty, and 5 years of believing that her husband was a monster incapable of love. The evidence mounted like snow drifting against a door, and Eleanor felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crack. Not from Frederick's persistent gentle siege, but from the simple undeniable truth that she had been betrayed not by her husband, but by a woman she had trusted, that Frederick's cruelty had been born not of his nature, but of manipulation so complete and so calculated that perhaps she might one day find it in herself to forgive him. The confrontation came on a grey November morning when Lady Beatrice arrived at Frederick's London house with her face arranged in an expression of concern that did not reach her calculating eyes. And Eleanor learned of it only later from James Harrington, who had witnessed the entire scene with the grim satisfaction of a man watching justice finally unfold. For Lady Beatrice had swept into the drawing-room, expecting to find her cousin amenable to her whispered warnings about the scheming woman who had somehow reappeared to threaten his peace. But instead she found Frederick standing before the fireplace with the forged letter in his hand, the very letter she had crafted so carefully 5 years ago in Eleanor's own music room, using paper she had stolen from Eleanor's writing desk and ink she had mixed to match Eleanor's own. And Lady Beatrice's face went white as December snow when she saw that damning evidence. Whiter still when James Harrington stepped forward with a leather case full of documents, including the signed confession of the servant she had bribed, the testimony of the music teacher she had destroyed, and the records of her mounting debts that had driven her to such desperate scheming in the first place. Frederick's voice when he spoke was not loud, but carried the terrible weight of a man who has discovered the foundations of his life were built on lies, and he told his cousin that he knew everything, knew about the forged letter and the bribed servant and the staged scene in the music room, knew that she had deliberately destroyed his marriage and driven an innocent pregnant woman into the snow because she wanted the Ravenscroft fortune for her own son, knew that every tear she had shed over his broken marriage had been false. Every whisper of comfort had been poison, every moment of the past 5 years had been built on her treachery, and Lady Beatrice tried first to deny, and then to explain, and finally to beg. But Frederick simply gestured to the door, where 2 constables waited to escort her to face the consequences of her crimes. Eleanor heard all of this from James that evening when he came to her small lodgings with Frederick following behind like a man approaching his own execution, and she watched her husband's face as James recounted Lady Beatrice's removal, watched the way Frederick's hands trembled at his sides and his jaw clenched with the effort of containing emotions too large for his body to hold. And she understood then that the unmasking of Lady Beatrice had not brought him peace, but rather stripped away the last barrier between Frederick and the full horror of what he had done, for as long as he could believe he had been righteous in his anger, he could bear the guilt. But now he knew that he had driven away his innocent wife and unborn child based on nothing but the manipulations of a scheming woman he should never have trusted, and that knowledge was destroying him from within in a way that Eleanor found she could not watch without something stirring in her chest that might have been pity or might have been the first tentative movement of forgiveness seeking a way through walls built of 5 years of justified rage. The days that followed Lady Beatrice's arrest settled over Eleanor like a strange quiet after a storm, and she found herself sitting in her small room with Thomas asleep in his narrow bed and Martha dozing in the chair by the fire, found herself staring at the wall where a water stain had spread across the plaster like a map of some unknown country, and she thought about forgiveness, about what it meant, and whether it was something she could give or something that would be taken from her, whether she willed it or not. For she had spent 5 years building a fortress around her heart, 5 years teaching herself that Frederick Ravenscroft was a villain deserving only of her contempt, and now the foundations of that fortress had crumbled to reveal not a villain but a fool, not a monster but a man so blinded by his own fears and insecurities that he had believed the worst of the woman who loved him, and Eleanor did not know if that was better or worse than the monster she had imagined. Frederick came again the next morning as he had come every morning since finding them. But this time there was something different in his bearing, something broken open and raw that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat when she opened the door, for he stood on her threshold not like a duke condescending to visit the poor, but like a penitent approaching a shrine. And in his hands he held not gifts for Thomas or provisions for the household, but a small velvet box that Eleanor recognized with a jolt that went through her body like lightning, for it was the box that had once held her emerald wedding ring, the ring she had left on his desk the night he drove her into the snow, the ring she had thought she would never see again. Frederick did not speak at first, but simply held out the box with hands that trembled visibly. And when Eleanor did not move to take it, he opened it himself to reveal the emerald gleaming against white silk, unchanged by the years, unchanged by everything that had happened, a perfect green stone set in gold that caught the pale morning light and threw it back in fragments that scattered across Eleanor's worn dress like a promise or a question, or perhaps both at once. "I kept it," Frederick said, his voice rough with emotion he was not trying to hide. "I told myself I kept it because it was valuable, because it belonged to the Ravenscroft collection, but I knew even then that I was lying to myself. Knew that I kept it because some part of me could not bear to let go of you entirely, could not accept that our marriage was truly over. And every night for 5 years I have taken this ring from my desk, and held it in my hand, and thought of you, and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. And now I know that I did. Now I know that I destroyed the only true thing I ever had. And I am not asking you to take this ring back, Eleanor. I am not asking you to forgive me, or to love me again, or to pretend that the past 5 years did not happen. I am only asking you to know that I have carried you with me every day of our separation, that you were never truly gone from my heart, even when I believed the worst of you." Eleanor stood in her small room, with the emerald ring glinting between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross, and she felt something shift in her chest, some wall that had stood firm through 5 years of hardship and hatred beginning to tremble at its foundations, for she had prepared herself for Frederick's anger and his accusations, and even his attempts to take Thomas from her. But she had not prepared herself for this, had not prepared herself for the sight of the Duke of Ravenscroft standing before her with tears tracking unashamedly down his face, and his hands shaking as he held out the ring she had left behind on that terrible December night. And she realized that she had never truly seen him cry before, not in all the months of their marriage, not even in their most intimate moments, for Frederick had been raised to believe that tears were weakness, and that a duke must never show his heart to anyone. Yet here he stood with his heart bleeding openly in the pale morning light, offering her not promises or explanations, but simply the truth of his suffering. She did not take the ring, could not bring herself to reach for it when so much still lay broken between them, but neither did she turn away, and her voice when she finally spoke was softer than it had been in any of their previous encounters, asking him why he had kept it, why he had not sold it or locked it away or thrown it into the sea. And Frederick closed his eyes as if the question caused him physical pain before answering that he had tried 100 times to rid himself of it, but every time he held the ring over a drawer or a strongbox, something stopped his hand, some voice in the depths of his soul that whispered he might need it again someday, that Eleanor might come back, that the story might not truly be over. Thomas stirred in his bed, and Eleanor's eyes darted to her son, to this child who carried both their features in his small face, and when she looked back at Frederick, she saw that he too was watching the boy with an expression of such naked longing that it stole her breath, and she understood then that whatever anger she still harbored, whatever wounds still festered in her heart, she could not deny Frederick the chance to know his son, could not punish Thomas for the sins of the father by keeping them forever apart. She reached out slowly, not for the ring, but for Frederick's hand. And when her fingers touched his, she felt him flinch as if burned, and then go utterly still, barely breathing, and she told him that she was not ready to forgive, not ready to forget, not ready to take back that ring and everything it represented, but she was willing to let him try, willing to let him prove through actions what his words alone could never convince her of. And Frederick nodded with the desperate gratitude of a man offered water in the desert, closing his fingers gently around hers, as if she were something precious that might shatter if he held too tight. The days that followed their tentative reconciliation unfolded like the slow turning of pages in a book Eleanor had thought forever closed. And Frederick came each morning as he had promised, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with something far more precious, with patience and presence and a quiet determination to earn what he knew could not be demanded. And Thomas, who had spent his entire young life without a father, began to warm to this tall stranger who sat on the floor of their cramped room without regard for his fine clothes, who listened with genuine interest to the boy's chatter about the birds he had seen in the courtyard and the stray cat that sometimes came to their window, who never once looked at the child with anything other than wonder and growing love. And Eleanor watched these interactions from her chair by the window, where she was still recovering her strength, watched the way Frederick's face transformed when Thomas laughed, watched the way his hands trembled slightly when the boy reached up to show him a treasured pebble or a bit of colored glass, and she felt something ancient and frozen beginning to thaw in the depths of her heart, felt the ice that had protected her for 5 long years starting to crack and splinter under the warmth of witnessing her son come to know his father. Martha remained suspicious, hovering in doorways and watching Frederick with narrowed eyes, but even she could not deny that the Duke was changed, could not pretend that the man who knelt in the dust to tie Thomas's shoes was the same cold monster who had driven them into the snow on that terrible December night. And one afternoon, when Frederick had gone and Thomas was napping, Martha sat beside Eleanor and admitted grudgingly that perhaps there was hope after all, that perhaps people could change when given reason enough, and Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks at these words, because Martha had been her rock through the darkest years, and her acceptance meant more than she could express. James Harrington came too, bringing news of the legal proceedings against Lady Beatrice, and Eleanor learned that the woman who had destroyed her life would face justice at last, that the forged letter and the bribed servant and all the poisonous lies would be exposed before society. And she discovered that she felt no satisfaction in this, no triumph, only a weary relief that the truth would finally be known, that her name would be cleared even among those who had whispered behind their fans and cut her dead in the street when she was first accused, and Frederick sat beside her as James spoke, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and when she glanced at him, she saw that his jaw was tight with suppressed emotion, saw that he was struggling with the weight of knowing how thoroughly he had been manipulated, how completely his own fears and insecurities had been used against him, and without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his, felt him startle at the contact, and then turn his hand beneath hers so that their fingers intertwined. And they sat that way as James finished his report, connected by this small touch that spoke of beginnings. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of healing, each day bringing small moments that accumulated like snowflakes building into something substantial, and Frederick found himself learning the rhythms of fatherhood with a hunger that surprised him, rising early each morning not from habit but from eagerness, dressing without his valet's assistance, in clothes that would not suffer from a child's sticky fingers, making his way through the London streets to the small room where his family waited, and he thought of them that way now, as his family, though Eleanor still held herself apart from him in ways that cut deeper than any blade, allowing him to know Thomas while keeping her own heart locked behind walls he had built with his own cruelty 5 years before. And he understood that he deserved nothing more, understood that every smile she did not give him was earned by every tear she had shed in exile. Yet still he hoped, still he watched for any softening in her grey eyes. Still, he treasured the rare moments when she forgot to be guarded and laughed at something Thomas said, her face transforming into the face of the woman he had married, the woman he had loved and failed so catastrophically. Robert Langley came to check on Eleanor's health, and Frederick forced himself to step aside, to watch the physician's gentle competence with something that felt shamefully like jealousy burning in his chest. For this man had been there when Frederick had not, had offered kindness when Frederick had offered only condemnation, had loved Eleanor quietly and faithfully, while Frederick had been drinking himself into nightly oblivion in a cold and empty estate. And when Robert looked at Eleanor, there was a tenderness in his gaze that made Frederick want to assert his claim, to remind everyone that this woman was still his wife, still the Duchess of Ravenscroft. But he had no right to such possessiveness, no right to begrudge her whatever comfort she had found in his absence. And so he remained silent, clenching his hands behind his back until his knuckles ached. It was Thomas who began to bridge the distance between them, his innocent questions and demands pulling his parents into shared moments they could not have orchestrated themselves, asking Frederick to help with a button while Eleanor prepared their simple meal, asking Eleanor to sing the lullaby he loved, while Frederick listened from the corner, his eyes closed against the memory of hearing that same voice in the music room of Ravenscroft Hall before everything shattered, and gradually, incrementally, Eleanor began to lower her defenses, began to address Frederick directly rather than through Martha, began to accept his presence as something other than a threat. And one evening, when Thomas had fallen asleep with his head in Eleanor's lap and his feet stretched toward Frederick on the narrow bed, she looked at her husband over their son's sleeping form and said quietly that Thomas had asked if Frederick could be his father, and Frederick felt his heart stop in his chest before she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, saying that she had told the boy yes. The word yes hung in the air between them like a gift Frederick knew he did not deserve, and he found he could not speak past the tightness in his throat, could only look at Eleanor across the sleeping form of their son and feel the full weight of 5 years pressing down upon his chest, years when this boy had grown and laughed and cried and asked questions about a father who was not there, years when Eleanor had borne the burden alone, had taught Thomas to walk and speak and love without any help from the man who should have been beside her, and the enormity of what he had lost, of what they had all lost, threatened to unmake him entirely in that small and shabby room that had somehow become the most important place in all of England. Eleanor watched him struggle with his emotions, and for the first time since he had appeared on her doorstep, she allowed herself to truly see him. Not the monster she had constructed in her memories, nor the cold duke who had pronounced sentence upon her in the snow, but a man ravaged by his own mistakes, a man who had been as much a victim of Lady Beatrice's scheming as she herself had been, and though she could not yet forgive him completely, could not yet release the protective anger that had sustained her through poverty and illness and despair. She felt something shift in her heart, felt the first fragile tendrils of compassion beginning to grow in soil she had thought forever poisoned against him. Thomas stirred between them, murmuring something in his dreams, and both parents reached instinctively to soothe him, their hands meeting over the boy's dark curls, and neither pulled away. And in that touch Eleanor felt the trembling of Frederick's fingers, and understood that he was as frightened as she was, as uncertain of this new territory they were entering together. He said her name then, just her name, Eleanor, speaking it like a prayer or a plea for absolution, and she heard in those 3 syllables all the things he could not yet say aloud, the apologies that would take years to fully express, the grief for time that could never be recovered, the desperate hope that perhaps something might yet be salvaged from the wreckage he had made of their lives. And she answered him with her own name for him. Not your Grace, not the Duke, just Frederick. And his eyes closed at the sound of it, tears slipping from beneath his lashes. And she realized she had never seen him cry, not once in their brief marriage, not on their wedding day, nor in their most intimate moments, nor when he had cast her out into the winter night. And seeing him weep now over their sleeping son cracked something open in her chest that she had thought permanently sealed. She did not tell him that all was forgiven, because it was not, could not be, not yet, but she told him that Thomas would need his father, that a boy deserved to know where he came from, and Frederick whispered that he would spend the rest of his life earning that privilege, and Eleanor believed him.